Hey there, I'm Stephanie Ramos here at the Pentagon, and this week we've been anticipating the city of Mosul to be freed from ISIS control. Pentagon officials here have told us that it could be any day now where the city of Mosul in Iraq could be freed, where ISIS could be completely pushed out of Mosul. Just to give you some perspective here, I'm going to show you here on the map. This is the Tigris River that separates eastern Mosul and western Mosul. This shaded area, this shaded green area, this is where Iraqi security forces posted themselves to push upward toward throughout western Mosul to take over this area, to secure this area. Now, if you look closely here, this shaded gray area, this is the old city of Mosul. This is what remains right here. This is the only area that ISIS occupies right now. This is what Iraqi security forces are dealing with and trying to take back. So that is what's left of Mosul, of the ISIS-occupied area of Mosul. Right now, we're going to speak with ABC's senior foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, who has been on the ground there, tracking all of these developments for us from Iraq. And Ian, you've made, in the recent days, you've made several trips into the heart of West Mosul. From your perspective, how close are Iraqi security forces to retaking? How close are they to retaking Western Mosul?
It's a question we've been asking for a long time now. The prediction has been 24, 48, maybe 72 hours. I mean, it has been that prediction for the last week. Yesterday afternoon, we were down on the front lines. At one point, we were no more than 20 yards away from ISIS positions. But the fighting is so close and so intense, and the old city is so claustrophobic that you can be that close and not necessarily see where the other side is. They are very, very close. They are down to a small area. It's impossible to describe accurately quite how difficult the fighting is there. The conditions, the weather is something in the region of 110 Fahrenheit during the day. There's no air in the old city. The air is thick with the smell of dust, of cordite, of gunpowder. And I'm sorry to say also the smell of decomposition. There are ISIS fighters in every alleyway you go. Most buildings have been destroyed or partially destroyed, so you have to climb over huge mounds of rubble to get even close to the front line. And there are civilians trapped there. Now, what the Iraqi security forces have been trying to do is minimize civilian casualties. There's been a lot of criticism that coalition bombing has increased the death rate among civilians. The counter-argument to that, of course, is that if ISIS weren't there, then there wouldn't be any bombing in the first place. But that's why it's so slow. That's why it's so unpredictable. But one tip to you. We expect that at some point, perhaps, the Iraqi Prime Minister Abadi will come to Mosul and declare victory over ISIS. And what we noticed was the Al-Nouri Mosque. This was the famous mosque that was destroyed by ISIS a couple of weeks ago, that the whole area around there is being cleared, and the Iraqi flag was flying from the mosque, an indication perhaps that the Prime Minister may be coming soon and that victory may well be declared.
And Ian, you've seen this on the ground there. We've been told here at the Pentagon that eastern Mosul, it took about 3 months to get ISIS completely out of there. This fight in western Mosul's taken about 6 months, still ongoing, much closer from what we hear, but still ongoing. Now, we've seen these images of men, women, and children, families fleeing the area, some of them hurt, wounded, and we hear from them yelling. Any idea? I'm sure you have an interpreter there on the ground, but what have some of these residents been saying? They've been under ISIS control for so long, for the last 3 years. What are some of the things you've heard there on the ground?
Yeah, Stephanie, you know, it's difficult to get over the raw emotion, the visceral, psychological emotion and upset that these people feel. I mean, they have gone to hell and back. I mean, they really have. Firstly, they've been living under one of the most brutal regimes or organizations that the world has ever produced. Many of these people have not had any proper food for at least 2 months. They've certainly had no clean drinking water. ISIS was charging them $6 a bottle. This is just for a small bottle of water about that size there, which wasn't even a clean drinking water. This is water that came from the Tigris River that you were pointing out earlier and therefore was polluted. What were they eating? Many people that we spoke to, the only thing they had to eat was wheat that had been put into this polluted water and then boiled. And then the children, the adults, that's all they had to eat. And so you noted one of the things that struck you the most, in fact, two things. The first thing was that the children in particular were so emaciated. I mean, they looked like they'd emerged from some kind of detention camp. And the second thing is that they were covered with this rash. The babies and the young children, even some of the women as well. And again, I understand that's because of the polluted water that they had to drink, and also that was the only thing for them to kind of wash their faces in. They were dirty, they were exhausted, they were shell-shocked. Of course, they were elated to be out. But time and time again, we heard the same story that if they tried to leave, even leave their homes, they would be shot by ISIS. I spoke to someone who told me that ISIS had welded up the windows and the doors of the house, put explosives right next to it. So if the Iraqi security forces broke in, then they would try and then it would detonate. And if the poor families who were trapped inside their own homes tried to escape, then it would also detonate. So these people really have been living hell. They've been prisoners in their own homes, and all they can do is listen to the fighting, listen to the bombing, hoping that the shells don't land on their own homes. And as soon as the Iraqi security forces go in, then they're able to get out. We've seen people have their first cigarette for 6 months, make their first phone call. Women are able to take off the hijab. I mean, they are now experiencing the kind of freedom that we all take for granted, and they've been denied by ISIS for 3 years.
My goodness, just such horrible conditions. Wow. Ian, as you very well know, I spent some time in Baghdad, but while I was there, there was heavy American presence there. Thousands and thousands of American troops, contractors, many of them pulling security and securing that area. Of course, none of which we see in Mosul right now. What we've heard here at the Pentagon is that Iraqi security forces are being trained by U.S. troops in this advise and assist mission. Local policemen are being trained as well in order to be able to secure their area once ISIS is finally pushed out of there. When you come across these families and these children, do you get the sense at all? It's probably difficult during this time when they're going through so much, but do you get the sense at all that they would like to eventually call this area home again?
That's a really, really good question. A few points to be made here. Firstly, I think it's fair to say that if it hadn't been for US training, US support, air support, but ground support as well, would Iraqi security forces be able to take Mosul? Possibly. But would they be there right now? Absolutely not. So the American role and the coalition role in this has been absolutely critical, especially in the training, because I was traveling with Iraqi counterterrorism forces, and they are incredibly impressive, very, very brave people. Their attrition rate has been pretty much unprecedented in modern warfare. It's been 30 to 40% of their men have been killed. Now, the Iraqis don't publish those numbers. They don't like to publicize it, but I know that has been the rate. So the people on the ground, yes, of course, they now need every possible assistance. You can win the battle, but can you win the peace? It's always a dilemma of these kinds of operations. But interestingly, a number of the people that we spoke to who came out of the old city said they would never wanted to go back. I mean, firstly, if you saw the level of destruction there, and hopefully we're going to get some pictures to you that we managed to take, we'll tell you why. Because those buildings are so damaged, and they've stood for centuries. They're so damaged that the only thing that can happen now is that they'll be razed to the ground. But one woman said to me, even if it's cleared, even if they rebuild, I don't want to go there because the place just reminds me of ISIS. And this is something that people will never forget. They will have to learn to live with it, but they'll never forgive and they'll never forget. And that presents a huge dilemma. The scale of reconstruction required in Mosul, the political involvement that's needed to try and bridge some of the divides that allowed ISIS to come in the first place. Remember, they swept in fairly easily. The local population, many people were happy to see ISIS because the government of Iraq had been so corrupt. So I think there's an enormous amount that needs to be done. And arguably, winning the peace will be harder than having won the war. And that's been difficult enough.
And for those people there, I mean, all of this is beyond traumatizing, even to just live it for one day, but to live it for 3 years, it's incredible. So just yesterday, we heard from a top general there on the ground saying that some assistance, extra assistance is on the way there to Mosul and other Iraqi provinces. It's called Police in a Box or Border Guard in a Box, basically a large shipping container that includes water tanks, GPS, vehicles, exactly what they need to start or to prop up a police station in these Iraqi provinces. It's a start. It's something, but do you think that in Western Mosul, there's been so much destruction and so much damage. Do you think this is something that could actually propel them in the right direction, in the direction toward rebuilding their city?
I mean, imagine this. We've all seen the images, either from old newsreels or in the movies, of post World War II Berlin, for example, or Dresden, or places in England that were bombed. I mean, look, yes, of course, every assistance is welcome. But the scale of need is off the charts here. I mean, these parts of these cities have been razed to the ground. You've got millions of people who've been made homeless. You have no physical infrastructure that's working there. The Iraqi government does not have the money to be able to rebuild and house people. And as I said earlier, absolutely key in this is the fact that the sectarian differences that exist in Iraq have not been bridged. There isn't a political settlement at the moment. There is a prime minister that's probably more willing to work with both groups and bring people together. Prime Minister Abadi has done a lot in that regard. But if you can't resolve things politically and you can't resolve things in terms of resources on the ground, the fear is that we'll be back here in another few years talking about the same conflict, the same situation, and the same conditions for the people on the ground. So this requires some large thinking. I mean, it requires an Iraqi equivalent of a Marshall Plan. I mean, there's nothing less than that. Really, is you can play at the edges and do some important things, work on civic society, work on good governance, all those things. And the U.S. government, to its credit, has been doing that tirelessly and endlessly over more than a decade now, as have other countries. Unfortunately, it just requires more. People need jobs, people need homes, children need schools. There has to be a functioning police force that works, that people can trust, that's independent, that's not corrupt. I mean, the list just goes on. And you think how long we've been doing it here, and I've seen this in Afghanistan as well. You're trying to remodel a society is, the task of generations. It's not the task of a single project or a single year.
And Ian, even when Mosul is liberated, there are still other Iraqi provinces that are occupied by ISIS. So this fight is not over.
No, look, that's a very important point, and important for the viewers to acknowledge. There are further pockets of ISIS in Iraq. Certainly to the west of Mosul, down towards the border with Syria. Then you have a large ISIS presence in Syria, and the parts of that border, they've got free movement across anyway. So as far as they're concerned, there's no border there at all. And then you have down the Euphrates River Valley, which kind of runs south of Raqqa, and then you have ISIS presence elsewhere. Then you remember that the organization has created franchises in a number of countries, in Afghanistan, in the Philippines, in Nigeria. And then you remember that sometimes you don't have to be a paid-up card-carrying member of ISIS to be a member of ISIS and to carry out attacks. You know, the people of San Bernardino, of Manchester, England, of London, of Paris, of Brussels, all know that ISIS is perfectly capable of carrying out attacks by people who've never been to Syria, who've never been to Iraq. As long as they're able to exist online, the virtual caliphate, if you like, then a threat will continue. Will it be diminished after Mosul is done, after Raqqa is done, after the so-called caliphate is defeated? Of course it will be. But they're still able to agitate and to recruit and to persuade people to carry out attacks online. And that will be the next battle. How do you change a mindset that has settled into so many disenfranchised, unhappy, angry, and misguided people across the world?
Definitely some devastating times for the people that live there and are living through this. That region has a long and difficult road to go. But Ian, thank you so much for your insight and in this in-depth look into what's happening there on the ground.
You're very welcome. Good to be with you.
Thank you. And that'll do it for us here from the Pentagon. I'm Stephanie Ramos. Thank you for watching on abcnews.com.